it's been an organizational feat for us at CASAR to try to bring this all together to host the Prince Alwaleed bin Talal Centers from both North America and Great Britain. We had an extraordinary meeting yesterday, and I think we wore everybody out, which is why we're a little late starting today. My name is Robert Myers. I'm the director of the Center for American Studies and Research here. And the panel today, we're going to have two public panels, one here and one in the evening. The one here today is entitled Perspectives on Islamic Studies and American Studies. And the participants whom I'd like to welcome are Dr. John Esposito, who's the director of the Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding at Georgetown University, and the associate director, Dr. John Voll, from Harvard, which is called the Prince Alwaleed bin Talal Islamic Studies Program, Dr. Roy Parvis Motadeh, and the associate director, Dr. Ali Hassani. From Cambridge, the bin Talal Center for Islamic Studies, Dr. Yasir Suleiman. From Edinburgh, which is the newest bin Talal Center, Dr. Hugh Philip Goddard, and Dr. Carol Hillenbrand, the chair of the advisory board. And from the Center for American Studies and Research at the American University of Cairo, Dr. Jerry Leach. We're very honored to have all of these participants. What we decided logistically is best to do is that we will ask Dr. Hassani from Harvard, who'd like to show you a brief video about a project that they're doing at the center at Harvard. And he'll talk about it a little bit, and then we'll all come up, because that's it as far as video presentations. So I'd like to turn the floor over to Dr. Hassani, and then afterwards we'll come up here. Each of us will try to talk a little bit about this question of integration, which is something we talked about at great length at our closed meeting yesterday. You know, is integration possible between these disciplines? How might it work? Here it's going to be a little bit more scholarly, intellectually. What are some of the questions in these various fields? I'm very honored and humbled to be on this panel with such a distinguished guest. So I'm going to turn things over right now to Dr. Ali Hassani of Harvard.
Good afternoon, everyone. My comments today are more from the perspective of Islamic studies and experiences in teaching about Islam within a liberal arts curriculum, specifically within the Harvard liberal arts curriculum. So I've got some prepared remarks because I was under the impression this was a more formal presentation. So I'll go through my remarks, and as Patrick mentioned, I will be actually showing a short video clip during the presentation. Now, over the 2 decades that I have been teaching at Harvard, I have been asked many questions about Islam, but I was ill-prepared when a couple of years ago, a student asked me over dinner, how can anyone who is rational and intelligent believe in and practice a religion such as Islam that promotes violence, terror, suicide bombings, and is blatantly against fundamental human rights and freedom? Now, frequently, what characterizes the majority of the questions I'm asked is not just a profound ignorance about a religion practiced by over 1 billion people, but a deep-seated prejudice, but also a fear of Muslims. I'm afraid of Muslims. A minister of a church in Boston confessed to me, even as he invited me to participate in an outreach event. Now, underpinning this lack of knowledge about Islam and Muslim cultures in the United States is a fundamental illiteracy about the nature of religion. Few people understand religion as a complex cultural phenomenon and the significant role that a variety of factors, such as poverty, social status, gender, political ideologies, etc., play in shaping what are overtly perceived as purely religious expressions. This illiteracy is a direct consequence of the failure of educational systems to provide students with the opportunities to engage critically in the academic study of religion. Employing social, scientific, and humanistic methods, the study of religion seeks to go beyond the faith-centered or devotional approach that is often employed in parochial or Sunday schools or madrasas and so on to promote the practice of a specific religion. It posits that religion is a dynamic and powerful force central to the human experience and is critical for the study of a broad range of subjects, a fact even recognized by the United States Supreme Court when it ruled on the importance of providing instruction about religion as a cultural phenomenon in schools. Quote, "It might well be said that one's education is not complete without a study of comparative religion or the history of religion and its relationship to the advancement of civilization." At every level of education, from grade school to high school to college, students encounter religion as they study history, literature, art, music, social studies, world civilizations, geography, and so on. Yet neither do the curricula of our schools equip students to think critically about religion as a cultural phenomena, nor are teachers who teach humanities and social science subjects in schools professionally trained to teach about religion. So what I want to talk about here is focusing on what I'm calling illiteracy about religion that prevails not only in the United States, but in many other nations as well. Its grave consequences on the ability of students to interpret and engage with the multicultural and multi-religious world in which they live, and attempts to foster religious literacy, particularly about Islam and Muslim cultures, in some of the courses I'm teaching at Harvard currently as part of this new initiative. So the problem, religious and cultural illiteracy. During its recent review of liberal arts education at Harvard, the task force assigned to this for this humongous project of trying to figure out what a new liberal arts curriculum should look like in the 21st century, this report observed that we are faced with the challenge of educating students about a world that is interconnected to a degree almost inconceivable 30 or 40 years ago. At the same time, the report points out that it is a world that is deeply divided, unstable, and uncertain. Now, it is one of the great paradoxes of our times that while people from different religious, cultural, racial, and ethnic backgrounds are in closer contact with each other as never before, yet this closeness has not resulted in better understanding and appreciation for difference. Rather, our world is marked with greater misunderstandings and misconceptions, resulting in ever escalating levels of tensions between peoples of different, who identify themselves differently. Some, of course, have characterized these conflicts as the clash of civilizations. I would, however, think that it's more appropriate from an educational point of view to talk about this as really a clash of ignorances. And the reason behind this clash of ignorances is widespread illiteracy about religion and culture. As a result of not having the intellectual tools to understand and engage with religious and cultural differences, people tend to paint those who are different from themselves with one color, with a single brushstroke, representing them through simplistic caricatures and other unjust forms of humiliation. The ignorance that is associated with religious and cultural illiteracy is not inconsequential. It has grave implications for the world in which we live. In her study on the prevalence of religious illiteracy in American educational systems, Diane Moore, the director of Harvard's program in religion and secondary education, identifies some of its consequences: the curtailment of historical and cultural understanding, the fueling of cultural wars, and the promotion of religious and racial bigotry. She remarks, our lack of understanding about the ways that religion itself is an integral dimension of the social, political, and historical experience, coupled with our ignorance about the specific tenets of the world's religious traditions, significantly hinder our capacity to function as engaged, informed, and responsible citizens of our democracy. In these ways, religious illiteracy has helped foster a climate that is both dangerous and intellectually debilitating. Professor Moore also points out that religious literacy is particularly important for the United States, which, despite being the most religiously diverse country in the world today, has a population that is woefully ignorant about religion itself and the basic tenets of the world's major religious traditions. The devastating impact of illiteracy on democracy, which is fundamentally premised on the existence of an educated and well-informed citizenry, was best summarized by Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers of the United States, when he wrote, "If a nation expects that it can be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be," unquote. Certainly, democracy cannot function when ignorance breeds fear of fellow citizens different from oneself. Now, religious and cultural illiteracy, ultimately, if it is not combated, strips peoples and nations of their history, their culture, their politics, their economics, in short, their humanity. It leads to what I would call this blame it all on Islam syndrome, for example, that if anything happens in a country that is majority Muslim, or if a person who happens to be Muslim does something, it's automatically attributed to the religion. You don't look for any other factors. History is full of examples of conflicts and tragedies that result from a group of people from one religious, racial, or ethnic background failing to accept and to respect the humanities of others. So in a pluralistic world, we all need to learn to engage, to have the tools to engage with difference and truly accept and respect one another. And education is really at the core of this. So, now let me say a little bit about how I'm defining religious illiteracy. Usually when we think about the study of religion, we can sort of classify different approaches, but the three approaches that I want to talk about today is one, what is called a devotional approach, where we think about religion as rites, rituals, and ceremonies. And people who think about religion this way is, in fact, I would say, the most common way in which people think about religion. This is the way in which people are socialized to think about religion, because in a way, even a child growing up, these are their encounters with religion. And certainly in certain textbooks and educational curricula, you do have an exposure to religion in this way, that you learn, okay, Hindus do this, Christians do this, these are their festivals, and so on. But this, I believe, does not counter religious illiteracy. The second approach that you find very common about religion is what I would say a textual approach, which equates a religion with a text, most probably the Quran or some, with a sacred text like the Quran. So Islam becomes equated with the Quran, Christianity becomes equated with the Bible, and so on and so forth. And this way of thinking about religion as text, in fact, deifies the text. And it's problematic from many different perspectives, because then people somehow feel that text actually is the religion itself. So if you want to find out about Islam, for instance, after 9/11, people wanted to find out about Islam. They bought up translations of the Quran, thinking that by reading it from cover to cover, they will learn about Islam. And of course, it's problematic from many different ways. Not only the fact that translations themselves are interpretations, but also this issue about what it leaves out is that texts in themselves have no meaning. It's communities of interpreters who give text meaning. And when you think about what influences how a person interprets a text, then you go into the political, social, educational, economic background of the individual. This actually then brings me to the third approach that I feel is is the best way to combat religious and cultural illiteracy, which I'm calling a cultural studies approach. Some people have called this a contextual approach, where you think about religion must be primarily concerned with human beings who actually practice and interpret it and whose lives it influences. And so you pay, religious traditions are therefore socioeconomic conditions, societal attitudes to gender, educational status, literary and artistic traditions, historical and geographical situations, so on and so forth. So that very often when you're dealing with religion, the study of religion is therefore interdisciplinary, and we have to use multiple lenses when we are talking about understanding a particular religious interpretation. So taking this cultural studies approach, that you think about religion as a phenomena that's embedded in very deep and intricate ways in a variety of contexts, how can we construct syllabi in a liberal arts curriculum? So I want to talk about two courses that I have introduced in the Harvard liberal arts curriculum that are used to combat religious illiteracy. The first course, both of these courses are designed to remedy the cultural myopia that afflicts prevalent views of Islamic civilizations and human societies by empowering students with appropriate content, vocabulary, and frameworks of analysis. Adopting a contextual approach to the study of Islam, both courses recognize that the experiences and expressions of faith are far from homogeneous or monolithic. In the course of its development, the tradition itself has been interpreted in so many different ways, depending on cultural traditions, socio-economic political structures, and physical location. Recognizing this reality, Abdul Karim Soroush, a contemporary Iranian intellectual, states that in reality the history of Islam, like the history of other religions, such as Christianity, is fundamentally a theory of interpretations. Throughout the development of Islam, there have been different schools of thoughts and ideas, different approaches and interpretations of what Islam is and what it means. There is no such thing as a pure Islam or an ahistorical Islam that is outside the process of historical development. The actual lived experience of Islam has always been culturally and historically specific and bound by the immediate circumstances of its location in time and space. If we were to take a snapshot of Islam as it is lived today, it would reveal a diversity of lived experiences which are all different yet existing simultaneously. Now, using this as the organizing principle, the two courses, the first one, Culture and Belief 12, as it's called, For the Love of God and His Prophet, is an introduction to Islam by examining the dynamic relationship between religious ideas, artistic expression, and literary context in Muslim cultures. So it's a way of thinking about Islam that goes beyond the normal sort of discourse of thinking about Islam as religion of empire. It is in fact inspired in part by the prolific cross-disciplinary scholarship of my own teacher, Professor Anne-Marie Schimmel, who fervently believed in the use of literature and the arts as ways of understanding religious traditions. The added advantage of using literature and the arts to introduce a religious tradition rather than political discourses, or I would say even straightforward historical discourses, is that literature and the arts tend to humanize Muslim countries and cultures that have been dehumanized by discourses of nationalism and patriotism, premised as they are on the notion of Muslim as the other, and that commonly slanted coverage of Islam and Muslim societies in the media. So the course introduces students by taking different literary and artistic genres that are central to the Muslim experience, such as the art of Quran recitation, calligraphy, the Arabic writing system, the ghazal, the love lyric, the Persian epic, the qawwali, and so on and so forth. And the course looks at the historical evolution of even institutions such as mosques in different cultural environments. Now, to promote this kind of an approach, at Harvard, again, as part of, I guess it's sort of reflective of the consumerist culture that we live in, those of you who have some familiar with the Harvard curriculum know that Harvard students go shopping for a week, shop their courses, and decide what they're going to take. And they physically go from class to class to determine which professor they like, what course appeals to them. And as part of this new, let's say, thinking about shopping in a technologically savvy world, the Harvard General Education curriculum has now started creating trailers, course trailers, advertising different courses so that students can now shop for courses online and actually get a sense of what a course is like by watching a course trailer. So I want to show you the course trailer for this course, Culture and Belief 12. So. We live in paradoxical times. We live in a world today where peoples of different cultures, religions, ethnicities, races are in closer contact with each other than at any other time in history. Ironically, this closer contact amongst peoples of different backgrounds has not led to better understandings of cultural and religious difference. In fact, we live at a time when there are greater misunderstandings, greater misperceptions, and stereotypes about different cultures in the world. Some analysts have claimed that this is the result of what they call the clash of civilizations. I, however, believe that the issue here is not the clash of civilizations. The issue is the clash of ignorances.
Every religion on the face of the earth is very dependent, really, upon the arts. Because the arts are the most direct and immediate way of communicating profound passions and profound beliefs. We can have a conversation till the cows come home, but if we are sharing in a chant or in a dance or in a ritual, that is like an arrow. It goes much faster.
This particular course uses the cultural studies approach to study Islam by highlighting an approach through literature and the arts. The course uses the arts as pedagogic bridges and involves several art-making projects. Students design their own Arabic calligraphy using different media such as montage, stained glass, photography, and even knitting. For another project, students compose their own poems and set them to music. Students also designed their own mosque for an urban American landscape. And it is a rather unique way to think about a religious tradition, because normally when we approach the study of a religious tradition, we are focused on doctrines and theologies and philosophies and so on. This course switches things around so that we approach the course through the arts, experience the religion through the arts, as it were, and then uncover the different doctrinal and theological dimensions. So there's a lot more that one can say about this particular approach, but I wanted to share this with you in terms of how we rethink teaching about Islam and studying Islam within a liberal arts curriculum. I think that teaching about Islam in a liberal arts context presents a unique set of challenges. Currently, as we know, Islam is the least understood and most feared of the world's major religions. Contemporary political and military tensions and confrontations have all contributed to really exacerbating the widespread illiteracy about religion. And consequently, many students approach the study of Islam with stereotypical notions about the faith based on what they've seen or read in media or in popular media. And after 9/11 in the United States, teaching about Islam has also become a politically charged activity, particularly as the religion is perceived in some circles as an anti-American and an anti-Western ideology. And so promoting greater literacy through this contextual approach, and in this course, through the arts, really tries to combat all of that by, as I would say, I think the best way to describe it is humanizing the Muslim experience. And I find that the arts are very powerful vehicles. I have another course that I teach, but which I'm not going to go into because in a way it's a more conventional course. But even that course tries to talk about contemporary Islam, but using the case study method by looking at Muslim situations in West Africa or Indonesia or South Asia and so on. But there, I would say the orientation is more using a political and a historical lens. And that's not too far from the traditional approaches that you find in American colleges. But this particular one, I wanted to share as something that I think would be useful in our whole endeavor in trying to create better understandings of the Muslim world as well as the American world or the Western world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Could those of you from the centers now come up and please join me on that stage? There's a stair over here that you can also use. Hi again. I introduced our panelists and participants, but if everyone would simply introduce, as it were, himself in this case, and your affiliation, I would appreciate it, and then we can sort of go from center to center. And thank you so much for that wonderful intervention. It'll be a marvelous point of departure, I think, for the discussion. But
let's start down there.
Okay. Yes.
My name is Yasser Suleiman, Cambridge University.
Okay. And Ali Hassani from the other Cambridge.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Hugh Goddard, and I'm the director of the Centre for the Study of Islam in the Contemporary World in the University of Edinburgh in Scotland.
I'm Jerry Leach. I'm the director of the American Studies Center at AUC in Cairo.
I'm going to cheat because the boss is down here. That boss. I am the associate director of the Prince Alwaleed bin Talal Center for Muslim Christian Understanding at Georgetown University. And it does take a little while to learn how to say all of that in one breath, but it's worth saying.
Thank you so much. What I would like to do is, this was actually a wonderful frame, and it's something that we can all enter into a dialogue with this presentation that we just saw. For instance, how might you combine some of the aspects of a course like this with American Studies? Suppose American Studies people came to visit. It came to mind a quite wonderful show I saw on Al Jazeera in English by Raghi Omar called Islam in America. You're familiar with it. We might talk about it. I simply would like to raise a couple of questions, and then what we'll do is go from center to center, and they can address the question as they'd like, and then we'd like all of you to join into the dialogue. Again, you can use these ideas or not as you see fit. Some came up when Ali was speaking, and others from yesterday, and others I've simply thought of. One question that came up yesterday is very interesting on perspectives on Islamic studies and American studies is, can they be integrated? And to what extent can they be integrated? It's wonderful to think, oh, you can, and disciplines can engage in dialogue, and people can, but can they in fact do so? What is the role of religion in this integration of disciplines? I think we had differing points of view on that yesterday, and there are a wide range of views of, what, for instance, Christian studies. If somebody said, oh, I'm involved in Christian studies, well, does that mean Holland? Or are they studying, what are they studying? Whereas there is this implication with Islamic studies. The role of the arts, we also talked the role of translation and the power relations inherent in the translation process. Certainly religious dialogue, Dr. Esposito talked about, John Esposito talked about direct religious dialogue, people entering into dialogue, whereas this intervention we just heard now was talking about how more oblique methods of engaging that, perhaps through the arts, are in fact more helpful. A couple of other possible things we can talk about or not. What are specific strategies for integration? Have they been done? Yesterday we talked about the conference, the biennial conference that CASAR has here that was started by Dean Patrick McGreevy as a way to define what American Studies was, and has had a huge impact on its redefinition by including people who are asking questions that heretofore would have been under the rubric of Middle East or Islamic studies. What's the role of popular culture in the question? Here again, Islamic studies, people might tend to think simply by using the term that you're talking about something more antiquated, that this does not imply a living, thriving, popular culture. And finally, perhaps a number of the interpretive tools that we engage in, say, literary criticism or other fields, where you look at sacred text in the same way side by side as you would look at an artistic text. Well, within some environments, people are completely happy with that. At Jerry Falwell's University in Lynchburg, Virginia, I'm not sure that he'd like to see Don Quixote and the Old Testament read side by side. So in some contexts, the tools that we engage in seem as if they work very successfully, and they're accepted by our students and faculty. So these are simply some of the questions that occur to me, and you can engage them or ignore them. But what I'd like to do is go center by center and start with John Vole, if I might, and talk about this question as Georgetown sees it.
Okay, I was rather hoping I wouldn't have to start. That's why I kept hinting going down there. Because I could be 15 seconds, but you know I'm a professor, so that's not going to work. But the simple fact is that the title of this is Perspectives on Islamic Studies and American Studies. And the question posed is integration possible? And the answer is yes. And the experience of the Prince Alwaleed bin Talal Center for Muslim Christian Understanding at Georgetown confirms that. And then I could stop. But of course I won't, because I'm going to preach a sermon. Some of you know that I preach sermons quite often. It's a real pleasure to be a part of the whole network of centers in 3 continents. And it's a pleasure also to think about, to have this occasion to think about what kind of things are we doing, especially because we're looking at 2 structures of centers where, at least by name, they look like they're talking about different things: Islamic studies and American studies, or in the case of our title, Muslim Christian Understanding. But the broad subject and that simple question of integration is really a very important kind of interactive subject with center programs. And I think it's worthwhile, because our center is the oldest one, actually, starting in the early 1990s, to just look a little bit at how the subject of our studies has changed in the last 15 years. At the beginning, even in the 1990s, early 1990s, Islamic studies studied Islam, but Islam as understood within the framework of regional studies or area studies, and so that most of the time Islamic studies was within the curriculum of some center for Middle Eastern studies. And if you wanted to study Islam in South Asia or Southeast Asia or in Africa, you weren't studying religion, you were studying anthropology, or you were studying something else. If you wanted to study the religion of Islam, you went to Middle Eastern studies, which of course then defined what Islam you would talk about. And Ali's course would have been impossible within that definition. And Ali's even what he called the traditional course, of looking at Islam in Malaysia. Well, when I tried looking at Islam in the Sudan in the 1960s, I had difficulty finding a home, whether it was in African studies or in Middle Eastern studies, and the end result was I didn't have any academic home at all which was the advantage then of going to a place that had neither African studies or Middle Eastern studies. I taught at the University of New Hampshire. But at any rate, Islamic studies was tied to Middle Eastern studies. And American studies, even in the 80s, was still tied to its tradition of origins too. Now I look around and I don't see very many gray hairs other than mine. And I certainly don't see many gray hairs here. But when I looked at American studies, when I was a student, it was dominated by somebody by the name of Vernon Partington, the mainstreams of American thought. And it was based on sort of literary criticism. It was based on literary criticism and then sort of the myth and image model that proved that America was an exception in the world. And so American studies, you couldn't do anything but look at mainstream, which in the old days meant WASP. That is, you know, my identity, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And if you were even studying Catholic studies, that was Catholic studies. That wasn't American studies. American studies was Vernon Partington's and Perry and so on of the great Puritan tradition. Now, suddenly, in the last 20 years, the world of Islam has changed and the world of America has changed, and the world of Islamic studies has changed and the world of American studies has changed. Now, when we started, when the center started in the first half of the 1990s, as Ali was analog of Huntington's Clash of Civilization. You had the West, which was really identified with WASP America, and you had the rest, which either you were a dedicated communist or you were a wishy-washy third world non-alignment person. And that was still really the way Islamic studies and much of American studies, by then you had people that were really kind of changing the underpinnings of American studies. But by the time of the 1990s, you see major changes. The particular changes, for our purposes, for my purposes here, for answering this question, yes, is that suddenly people began to realize that there were Muslims outside of the Middle East. I can remember when I started teaching in New Hampshire, it would be fun to go to a public lecture. And I would say, okay, I'm supposed to introduce Islam. And I would say, okay, how many people think they know what is the largest Muslim country in the world? In the 1960s and in the 1970s, you almost never got anybody in any public audience who knew that the largest Muslim country in the world was not a Middle Eastern country. Nowadays, I ask that question. I won't do a test here. But nowadays, I ask that question even in the Rotary Club of some, Rochester, New Hampshire, and virtually everybody knows that Indonesia is the largest Muslim country in the world. Somehow, we've had a different kind of awareness. And particularly, there is the awareness that there are Muslims outside of the Middle East. More specifically, for our purposes of American studies, they discovered that there are lots of Muslims in the West. And part of the impact that this had then on our center, as we started trying to show that civilizations could get along, part of our task really developed into talking about Muslims in the West, in which all of these discussions, pro or con, of Huntington really were irrelevant in a sense. Can Muslim Egyptians get along with American evangelicals or something like that? That's an interesting question. But can Americans who happen to be Muslims get along with Americans who happen to be Christians is not a Huntington question. It's a different question. And so one of the major projects of our center ended up being a project funded by an important grant from the Pew Foundation, which talked about Muslims in the American public sphere. And we were trying not to talk about these strangers. This was not a study of Al-Qaeda coming in to take over the Rotary Clubs of Rochester, New Hampshire. This was a study of how normal Americans who happen to be Muslim operate within the public sphere of the United States. And in that sense, then, our Islamic studies and our American studies came to be importantly integrated, was definitely not a real possibility. So that as we look now at this question of are Islamic studies and American studies compatible? Can they be integrated? Can they be brought together? Yes. And it's interesting to see what kind of courses, once you answer yes, what kind of courses you can offer. We offer courses in Islam in the United States, Islam in Western Europe. We offer an Islamic world course. I mean, Georgetown has the normal Middle East Civ 1 and 2, Muhammad to the present, equal to the map of the Middle East. We also offer, in addition to that, a course on the Islamic world, which is Jakarta to Chicago. And in our conferences and meetings, we are able then to draw together people from a wide range of groups and civilizations. But just finally then, probably the major change is the major challenge. What is it that we debate about? You know, not what do we agree about, but what do we debate about? At the beginning of the 1990s, there was the debate. Clash of civilizations. Are they clashing? Can we have dialogue? And so on. But now that the concept, this is a different lecture, so it's just one little phrase. Now that the concept of civilization is absolutely irrelevant for purposes of analysis of either Islamic studies or American studies, the arguments are different. And that is that the arguments are revolve around forms of fundamentalist exclusivism, whether it's secularist fundamentalism or religious fundamentalism or economic fundamentalism, can forms of fundamentalist exclusionism be brought into a kind of functional relationship with the pluralist reality of the world that we now live in. We are no longer in a separate world in which it's possible not to view America as if it was just simply, quote, a city set on a hill, to use the grand phrase of the old Puritans. It's not just a city set on a hill that's exceptional anymore. It's a part of the world. And in the same way, Islamic studies is not just simply the study of some exotic or separate civilization, but as Ali really showed us, it's the study of our own lives as well. And so, yes, compatible, and yes, ACMCU's program show that it's so.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to hear from Jerry Leach at Cairo. The one thing I would add, and I think John Vold did, is came up repeatedly in our discussions yesterday too, is to get away from this bipolar world. I don't mean lithium, in the sense that we're not simply talking about the United States and Middle East, North Africa. That inevitably Europe is very much part of the conversation. Some of the centers are in Europe, and it makes no sense whatsoever to have those sorts of oppositions, and of course Islam outside of this part of the world. They're very important in redefining these disciplines in this question. Thank you, Jerry Leach.
Okay. Thank you, Robert, and thanks to John Vold on my left for that very elegant and wide-ranging statement. Had a great deal of meat to it, and I appreciated hearing it myself. For me, the essence of the answer to the question of integration of these ostensibly quite separate pursuits of knowledge, if you like, really arises from the motive behind the creation of all of these centers by Prince Alwaleed. The centers were actually brought in to being by the prince's sense of mission, his desire to try to step in and help make the world a better place, help knit it back together after the attacks of 9/11, and the center at AUB and AUC were the original centers out of the 6 that now exist. The underlying concept was essentially that the two sides, the Islamic world, the Arab world, if you like, and the Western world, especially the U.S., there was a very deep chasm of misunderstanding and hostility. And that chasm of misunderstanding and hostility largely playing itself out outside of academia rather than inside of academia had to be addressed. So the goal was to try to deepen the understanding on one side of the other side, that is, on the part of Americans, of Islam, the Islamic world, the Arab world, etc., on the part of Arabs, their understanding of the West, what it was all about, what its fundamental premises are, where its policies come from, how its societies work, etc. In other words, to try to begin to close this chasm that had developed, if you like, in the public minds of these two different parts of the world. I happened to meet the Prince in my first year as the AUC director. I was on an AUC delegation going to meet him in Riyadh. And in that meeting was a very interesting statement. He basically went back over the underlying premise of all of our activity, and he said essentially, you know, everybody in my world, everybody in the Arab world that I deal with on a daily basis, they all feel that they are thoroughly knowledgeable and have really the right understanding of the Western world, especially America. And I, who've put a lot of time into the U.S., educated there, and deal with its economy on a regular basis, I realize that this is woefully inadequate, that their level of knowledge is very shallow, and much of it is wrong, and much of it is really a construction to essentially turn the Western world into that which is anti-Islam. And I mean by anti-Islam not basically political hostility, but whatever Islam is, then the Western world represents the opposite of that. In other words, it's a conceptual concept rather than a political concept. So whatever the West is essentially the opposite of whatever people believe Islam is. And he said this is, of course, just fundamentally nonsense. And the people that we at the what was the Kingdom Foundation, now the Prince Alwaleed Foundation, we're going to work on this. And of course, a number of the staff members from that foundation are here in the audience, though not at the table right now. And we want the two centers in Beirut and in Cairo to work on that chasm as well. So we basically are doing exactly that through American studies at AUB and AUC, and we've made some headway against a very, very large target, a very, very large objective, of course, of trying to reshape the thinking and try to produce a better, more nuanced, more, if you like, gray rather than black and white understanding of the Western world and America in particular. So that's what we're all about. There are two types of American studies programs in the world. One way of approaching American studies is through literature and the arts and media and cultural studies. The other way is through the social sciences, which emphasizes the fact of different economies and political systems, which are premised on different foundations, different histories altogether, in some degree histories in conflict with each other, and societies that have shaped themselves over 2,000 or 3,000 years worth of time, and are not, while they share a lot, are not fundamentally, you know, they're not identical at all. In other words, there's overlap, but there's also lots of areas of disagreement or where we don't share in institutional terms. So that's how we look at it, and basically in Cairo we take the social science approach to American studies, and in particular we are working on what we basically emphasize outreach rather than activities on the campus. The reason for that is two or threefold, and the first and foremost one is that AUC is itself a kind of large-scale American studies program. That is, it has 20 or 25 courses that are directly about the U.S. It has 30 some odd courses that are partially about the U.S. It has 1/3 of its faculty that are Americans, and it should be, in fact, higher, but it's about 126 out of 345, if you like, of the full-time faculty are Americans. And also because it's a center for the teaching of Arabic and Islamic and Middle Eastern studies, primarily servicing people from outside the region. There are on the campus in the course of any given year about 1,000 Americans and maybe 600 individuals from lots of other countries, including Europe and Africa, Asia, and the like. So we've made some headway. I'd like to say we've, pushing the ball against a partially closed door. That door was very nearly closed shut because of the Bush administration and because of the initial perceptions of where the U.S. Was going after the 9/11 attacks, because there was a widespread misunderstanding in Egypt about why the U.S. sent troops into Afghanistan. Most of Egyptians were not aware that the attack launched on New York and Washington had in fact been planned and executed from within Afghanistan. So from the point of view of the average Egyptian, it looked like a kind of arbitrary attack on Afghanistan, and later a better understanding of that has come to pass. But when it came time to see Iraq, that is the invasion of Iraq in March of 2003, the sense that America was out to destroy Islam, the sense that America was seeking to build a worldwide empire and the Middle East would be a part of it, etc., the sense that America was ready to attack anybody in the Middle East that disagreed with it, etc., and that, of course, America was ready to stuff democracy down anybody's throats who disagreed with its policies, etc. These points of view that emerged right after 9/11 and especially after the attack on Afghanistan were essentially confirmed in the Egyptian mind. That is, the idea that America was out to attack whoever it chose to attack in the Middle East, to those who disagreed with it, those that did not like, etc., was simply confirmed. Yes, the invasion of Iraq now shows that we were right in our analysis, our hypothesis that America's out to invade anybody that disagrees. Yes, Iraq proves that we were right all along. The fact that America just abolished the Iraqi government and the military and all of the institutions and stood down, essentially stopped the working of the whole institutional structure of Iraq and put American officials in charge, again confirmed the idea that America was building an empire. This is exactly the way empires start. You send in your troops, you defeat, and you take over, and your officials begin to govern. Well, American officials were governing from April of 2003 until 2006, etc. For all practical purposes, it looked to Egyptians like this was becoming an American colony, and they could not, given the fact that they understood there's a great deal of oil, they could not imagine the circumstance under which America would ever withdraw unless by some hook or crook the oil just disappeared in Iraq. So basically, the standing of the U.S. and therefore the attitude of Egyptians, and they are of course about a quarter of the Arab world, just plummeted after the invasion of Iraq. It went actually down to 1% approval rating, the worst it's ever been in the history of U.S.-Egyptian relations, and America came to stand in the public mind essentially, or be seen as the source of all the major evils in the world. And during that time, the American Studies Center was started at AUC. It actually started in 2004 after the details of the arrangements had in fact been worked out, and it started in a climate of high anti-Americanism. That anti-Americanism expresses itself in everyday activities and across Egyptian societies. It basically is not found at the upper levels of the Egyptian government, but below the upper levels of the government, it exists even amongst the educated elite of Egypt, and I put that at about 5 million people, though there it's relatively weak. It's not as vociferous and certainly never violent, if you like, but as you go down the socioeconomic ladder and the ladder of education, it gets stronger and stronger and stronger. Well, it's been an uphill battle in Cairo, but some inroads have been made. The biggest change, of course, that's helped enormously is the departure of Bush and the arrival of Obama. Despite everything we've tried to do out of the center, about 50% of Egypt is still convinced that Obama is a Muslim. But they like his style, they like the way he speaks. His Cairo speech went down enormously well. The other of the changes, in addition to Bush to Obama, that's made a difference in Egypt is that it's clear now to Egyptians that the U.S. has given up on the policy of compelled democracy and is not any longer trying to stuff democracy down the throats of everybody that it chooses to oppose, if you like. So now sailing is a lot smoother, doors are a lot more open, and it's possible to work with the general public. It's possible for the members of the center, namely me, to be on Egyptian national television, and also to try to basically work with Egyptians on areas that do indeed deepen understanding, but also to work on areas in Egypt where we, as two different societies, are partners in facing very, very difficult problems ahead of us, and that's turned out to be a very fruitful approach to us. I think in particular of global warming. I have been an environmental enthusiast and activist for more than 30 years. And when I arrived, I looked into the issue of global warming, and I discovered it was effectively non-existent on the public agenda, that nobody was paying attention to it, and basically the Egyptians who'd heard of it were excusing themselves, saying we didn't cause the problem, so we don't have to enter into the solution of the problem. And I've been basically trying to get Egyptians to understand that everybody in the world, including Egypt, which did not cause the problem, is still going to have to be a part of the solution. And oh, by the way, if you don't get active and get active fast, then the Nile Delta is going down the drain, and that's, of course, about 60%, maybe two-thirds of the Egyptian population and about 60% of the Egyptian food supply. So working very hard on that with the Egyptian environmental movement, which is very small, we've been able to push the government quite hard, and the government's finally recognized that it's got to get serious and it's got to do something about rescuing the Nile Delta, or it's going underwater in the distant future. So with that, that's what American Studies is all about, and again, it's the reciprocal relationship that the Prince set up at the beginning of all this activity, namely to try to produce a better understanding across the chasm of the Western world and the Muslim world, which I think helps understand why it is that we can sit here together and make sense of a joint presentation. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Dr. Leach. Now we'll hear from Dr. Hugh Goddard at our Edinburgh Center.
Thanks very much. And can I just say it's a great, interesting feature to be able to discuss these issues in such an international context. And so thanks to both our hosts at AUB and also to the Alwaleed bin Talal Foundation for making this meeting possible. I was very struck by way of preface as Professor Asani was talking about his course, which is designed to humanize Muslims, of an incident which took place in my early years of teaching about Islam in the UK, not in my current institution, in other words, I hasten to add, when for the first time I took a group of students to visit a local mosque. And this was 30 or so years ago, students who had no knowledge of Islam, no experience of meeting Muslims. And we went to the mosque, we came back, and we had a kind of debriefing session afterwards. And I asked the students what they had thought of the experience. And an absolutely delightful girl put her hand up and said, they were almost human. And was then immediately overcome with confusion because she realized what she'd said. And clearly she didn't mean it in quite the way in which it appeared to others. But as an indication of the problem which the Alwaleed Centers are designed to address, and in a sense as an illustration of the issue which Professor Asani is mentioning, that is perhaps one. Now, I come from the UK, and I'm conscious that, in a sense, insofar as I represent anything, I represent a kind of third culture unit in the discussion, namely, if you like, European studies, somewhere between American studies and Islamic studies. And, of course, the British bit of Europe has strong connections with the United States on the basis of language, and it also has some connections, at least, with the world of Islam on the basis of a shared history and a number of interesting historical encounters over the course of the centuries. And it's very nice, therefore, to discuss these issues here in Beirut, where, as an illustration of shared history, the motto, I notice on the roster, is in Latin. And if we think back 1,500 years, we find that at that stage, Great Britain, the majority of Great Britain and the Lebanon were, of course, part of the same political unit, namely the Roman Empire. And it's rather interesting to see a Latin inscription coming to Beirut via the east coast of North America. And that's an interesting example, therefore, of cultural and historical transmission. In reflecting, though, as I say, perhaps as an outsider in both senses on American studies and Islamic studies, I've got three brief remarks of possible shared issues for American studies and Islamic studies, and then, in a sense, a question which I hope may be helpful for our own discussion and for possible questions in the second half of our session. But shared issues, number one, there is a debate going on, certainly in Islamic studies and possibly also in American studies, about outsider and insider perspectives. In the UK, the question very crudely is sometimes asked, is it possible for somebody who's not a Muslim to understand Islam authentically? And I guess you could raise the same question, is it possible for somebody who is not American to understand the United States effectively? And it doesn't matter whether you're talking political systems, cultural issues, sporting traditions, these are questions for both disciplines. And the same is, of course, also true for European studies. Is it possible for non-Europeans to fully understand Europe? Well, I think the answer to the question is, of course, outsiders and insiders will probably have slightly different understandings. Outsiders will certainly have to work harder in order to come to a fuller understanding. But if we argue that it is not possible, the situation really is hopeless. And it must be possible to some extent, at least, for outsiders as well as insiders to understand these various traditions. And perhaps in the global world in which we all live, the best solution to the question is for insiders and outsiders to study these traditions together. And again, that's a very positive model which the Alwaleed Centers between us are seeking to follow. So that's number one, the debate between outsiders and insiders. Second area is with respect, if you like, to the syllabus, the tension, the debate between what one might describe as classical approaches and contemporary approaches. Where does the emphasis lie? And in a sense, Professor Vole has already hinted at this in his remarks. Is the emphasis primarily historical, textual? Is it the great classics that are primary? Or is it the current scene and what is going on in the world today? Is it current political leadership and current cultural phenomena? Or is it the great texts of the past? And it doesn't matter, in a sense, whether you're asking the question about Quran and Hadith or about Declaration of Independence and Gettysburg Address. Are those the texts that are necessary in order to understand the cultures, or are the more contemporary phenomena more important? And again, my suggestion would be that it is, in practice, of course, necessary to have both. You can't understand Islam simply on the basis of texts, any more than you can understand the United States on the basis of texts. But the texts are nevertheless important. You can't understand the traditions without some understanding of the texts. And the same is true, again, in a European context. And the third issue, in a sense, with reference to academic structures, is where do these subjects fit in academic structures of universities and disciplinary structures of syllabi? Is the ideal, therefore, to have separate units devoted to the study of American studies or Islamic studies? Or is it more effective to have people in the, if you like, the traditional, what are often in many universities the larger, the more powerful disciplines, people in history, people in politics, people in literature, people in religion, studying Islamic studies or American studies. And there is a great debate about this currently in the UK, where, as it happens, there are, in round figures, about 10 university departments of American studies and about 10 departments of Islamic and Middle Eastern studies. And that's out of about 140 universities. So is that the model? Is it better to have more departments particularly devoted to these issues? Or is it better to have, in some cases, individuals in institutions trying to introduce at least some understanding of American studies or Islamic studies? Now, people will differ on that. My view, again, is that both are needed. There is a need for breadth, in other words, to give as many students as possible the opportunity to learn something about American studies or Islamic studies. So you need as many universities as possible who have somebody teaching about these things. But then you do also need, if you like, depth, the particular concentration of expertise and interests in a number of departments which are able to look at, if not the full, at least a fuller range of aspects of American studies or Islamic studies. Question, therefore, that I'd like to end with is, again, the obvious one which colleagues have already begun to address, namely the relationship between the two. And here we are in Beirut. We've heard how the United States is the most religiously diverse society in the world, was it? Certainly in a Western context. Here we are in Beirut in the most religiously diverse society in the Middle East, certainly in the Arab world. Is it possible in a context such as this one for these two subjects to be linked, whether through courses, modules on the relationship between the world of Islam and the West, or modules, courses on Christian-Muslim relations in particular? And the answer, I hope, on the basis of our discussions, is that such a development would certainly be desirable. Very much hope that it may also be possible, because here in Beirut, not too far away, there are Catholic Christians, Orthodox Christians, Protestant Christians, Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims, Druze, and others who we could mention. Surely a unique opportunity as a meeting place for these questions to be asked. And just thinking before lunch of models and precedents, three names immediately sprung to my mind, and I'm sure others will spring to the minds of others. But I would only have to think of Charles Malik, or of Georges Khadr, or of Syed Hussein Nasr, whose lectures, which formed the origin of his book, Ideals and Realities of Islam, were, I think, based on lectures which were delivered here at the American University in Beirut, to see that there is a certain tradition, a certain precedent, and the hope might very much be that colleagues here would be able to develop the subject on behalf of a much wider community simply than the Lebanese one. So one or two remarks and a question, and I hope that will stimulate discussion, as I say, afterwards.
Thank you very much, Dr. Goddard. Dr. Hassani, would you like to speak again or join us in the conversation?
I just want to make just a very brief comment,
Sure.
and then, hand the mic over to Yasser. Listening to these comments, I think one of the issues, listening to the comments, one of the issues that comes to my mind, and sort of it relates to both Islamic studies and American studies, is really the larger question that again, going back to my experience teaching in a liberal arts context in the United States, and the issue that I think in the academy we have, we've sort of discouraged this view of the clash of civilizations and so on in the way we teach. However, there are many people that actually sincerely believe in this. So for instance, I think one of the biggest questions that you have in the United States, debates about, is it possible to be Muslim and American at the same time? Or are these two entirely different things? And you see the debates about this, are highlighted, for instance, in the election of President Obama. As part of his campaign, there was this this whisper campaign, this rumor campaign, that Obama is a secret Muslim, and therefore he cannot be truly American. And his election is a part of a ploy to actually get a Muslim into the White House. And obviously not all Americans think this way, but there's a very strong religious right wing that thinks about the Muslim as the other, even in the United States. So Reverend Rod Parsley, who happens to be the spiritual guide of John McCain, in fact, in one of his speeches, claimed that America was founded to actually destroy Islam. Now, when you get that kind of a rhetoric that's coming out, I think what it's indicative of struggles in the general American sort of media. What does it mean to be American? And obviously there are Americans who are willing to embrace pluralism and think about being American in many different ways and saying this is what America is about. And then there are others who are still intent on defining American in racial terms and also in religious terms. Really, there are groups that think about American as white and Christian.
WASP.
And WASP, yeah. So I think that there's this debate, and I think also in Europe, there's this debate because Europe has become pluralist in makeup, but not in spirit. What does it mean to be French? What does it mean to be British? And this idea of that, can you accept people who are different from yourself because of their religion and their cultures? To be British is the same in an equal way, right? And these are the big debates. And I think this is where, in fact, the boundaries of how we study and teach about Islam and how we study and teach about the West or America actually are starting to intersect in ways that have, I think, a deep impact on the grassroots level. And one of the things that I try to do in my courses on Islam to the arts is, of course, we have a whole section on American Muslims expressing themselves through American art forms or Western art forms like rock music. We have a section on punk Islam and so on and so forth. But just to say that how, really one can be, American in very deep ways and Muslim at the same time and not see a conflict between the two, and really raising the questions to the students that how are you going to define yourself as American based on all this rhetoric that goes on. It's reported in the media, but you also see it in radio, TV shows, and so on. It's part of the motivation is to address that problem.
So that there is some time for discussion. First of all, listening to the presentations, if our American colleagues tell us that there is a possibility for integrating Islamic studies with American studies, who am I, a Palestinian British person, to disagree with that? I'm just going to take their word for it and just run with the argument. So they can. But let me just throw a few spanners in the works and see if I can succeed in doing this. First of all, I look at Islamic studies and American studies as blurred categories that don't have any sort of defined sets and limits, which is not a bad thing. I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but we really need to, first of all, to understand what is precisely meant by Islamic studies, what's precisely meant by American studies, and then having done that along the lines of categories of analysis, then to see whether they can really be integrated, and if they can be integrated, at what level and in what ways they can be integrated. Because if we don't do that, I think we'll be falling into the rhetoric of goodwill, which in the academy doesn't carry you for a long, long sort of way. And I think it's better to be hard-headed about it and say, well, these are the ways we think in practice, in reality, but also in a way that we can sell to other colleagues who can be the most skeptical of skeptics, that these can be brought together and can be made to work together. But then that doesn't have to be an exclusive working together, because other disciplines might say, well, all right, of course we could do exactly the same. And if you can do this across a number of areas, then perhaps the integration is not an integration that is born out of something special about Islamic studies and American studies, but something that crosses the boundaries of many disciplines in the humanities and the social sciences. So I think it's important to be a little bit more hard-headed. Now, is Islamic studies a discipline? Is it a field? Is it a subject area? What is it? And the same is true of American studies. What is American studies? Is it a subject area? Is it a field? Is it a set of disciplines? What is it? Who teaches on it? And what are the backgrounds of those people who teach and regard themselves as part of the academy that services these two, Islamic studies and American studies? It's important that we really do it that way if we want to sell it to others and make it a concept that can work for us. What are the methodologies that are used inside these disciplines, Islamic studies and American studies? Are there similarities between the methodologies that we use? And are these methodologies, if they're similar between these two subject areas, fields, whatever they are, in the final analysis, are these exclusively sort of restricted to Islamic studies and American studies? Or are these things that somehow apply to other things? And therefore, there's really nothing special about integrating American studies with Islamic studies. I'm trying to make it a little bit more sort of complex and messy so that we can work through it. Again, the teaching approaches. I mean, we have seen a very excellent example of how one could present Islamic studies as understood in its own context. The context here is Harvard. The context here is a liberal art kind of education. How can those approaches, can they travel? Can they be pressed into service in presenting American studies? And if so, in what way? We'd like to see the exchange rates methodologically in terms of content and in terms of approach between American studies and content and Islamic studies. We want to see the convergence between them and also the divergence before we really, really come up with the answer to this question. It's not an easy question to answer. Let me just also reflect on the institutional setup of Islamic studies and American studies. Disciplines, subject areas, whatever you have as area of learning, of teaching, of study, is institutionally embedded. Even within the same country, different departments, different universities will somehow have different expressions, understandings of the same label, Islamic studies. And it is really important to think of that. And those institutions that have their own histories, they also have their own interested parties inside them who are going to fight you and either exclude you or include you because they have vested interest ultimately about socioeconomic opportunities and powers and privileges that they want to keep to themselves or open up and allow other people to start to share in them. Let me say this, that I think it's wonderful what Ali is trying to do, and I think it works wonderfully because it actually emphasizes Islam as a lived experience, provides an ethnographic understanding of Islam that is then used as a way of presenting a more systematic approach that could be on the classical, contemporary, insider, outsider, and on that, the question is asked of me, it is not that whether outsiders can present a real understanding of Islam. The question is sometimes asked, can Muslims really present an objective view of Islam? There's this suspicion that the insider is always prejudiced, can't present an objective view of Islam. I mean, that also is as it were, the counterpoint of the one that you've raised, Hugh Goddard. But just getting to the sister university, I would call it the daughter university. It's a daughter of Cambridge called Harvard. Now, I can tell you, I really am a great admirer of what you have, and we have talked about it. I love what you're doing. But I will tell you that if I were to attempt it at my Cambridge, the original Cambridge, I would be made the laughing stock of the whole Cambridge community. Institutionally, the UK system will not allow you to do that kind of thing. Therefore, this would not be seen as part of Islamic studies. This is part of, as Hugh and I were talking about, part of a continuing education kind of degree. We have an understanding of degree structures and the way that you organize them and teach them and present them and approach them, which is vastly different from the liberal art approach to study. We believe in something different. And that actually presents you with another complexity when you talk about Islamic studies. I'm sure those complexities can translate into European studies, into American studies. So although that I've, for reasons of Middle Eastern, well, the Iranians, or they were called ta'aruf, but the idea of civility and the idea of mahabba and ahlan wa sahlan, I agreed that there can be integration. I'm still a skeptic because I would like to see the case done on a solid foundation in a way that convinces me that these things can be brought together in a way that is really symbiotic, that's really productive, and that makes them closer to each other than other associations that can be established between American studies, Islamic studies, European studies. I would like to say that if there's anything, there's something which is much larger than Islamic studies and American studies. It is the way that different disciplines feed into the study of these cultures and traditions, including the social sciences, the classical ways, and they apply selectively differently to Islamic studies and American studies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Suleiman. If we don't have a clash of civilizations, we certainly have a clash of perspectives, which should make for a very interesting question and answer period. Again, I don't want to frame what people have said, but I took a couple of notes, and then I'd like to open the floor for questions, and our responses can be in the form of a conversation. You can direct it to a particular individual, or you can throw it to the panel. Certainly, Hugh's perspective and question about insider, outsider, I think is enormously helpful in thinking, for example, about American studies in a place like Beirut or a place like Cairo. What's to be gained, assuming that the discipline itself has, any inherent value. Jerry Leach's question about is there in fact an inherent dichotomy between the arts, literature, et cetera, versus a political, historical, economic approach? Or do they necessarily intersect in ways? John's, his, I would say, construction of a category called secular fundamentalism. What is that category? And therefore, if someone wants to engage in these sorts of discourses, but is not particularly interested in religion per se, is not interested in secular texts per se, then what is one talking about, or is one taking a fundamentalist point of view, is to take religion not totally out of the equation, but to see it culturally. And obviously, the question here about discipline. Are there inherent values within these disciplines? I think that John's question about genealogy, where did they come from? What's the historical basis? Why did area studies in the United States evolve in the way it did? Why did American studies evolve? They're not ahistorical questions. Certainly, Ali's intervention about the whole idea of the inherent incompatibility, it sounds like shuttling the clash of civilizations in by different means, and it also posits some sort of essence. Certainly, it's fascinating to think, for example, Amy Kaplan, whom I talked about yesterday, when she gave a talk about Exodus, talked about the construction of Judeo-Christian, that in fact is a term that comes into being around 1960, the time of Exodus, and in fact, to historicize those sorts of things. And of course, a secret Muslim, all you have to do is think of the term secret Christian scientist to realize how preposterous it is at the same time as being nefarious. Finally, getting back to Yasser's very meticulous, analysis in terms of origin, field, department, methodologies, and why the kind of approach that Ali presented at the beginning, why some people at one institution might find that not an effective approach, or one to be dismissed out of hand, and certain people on the other side of the pond, so to speak, looking at it as an extraordinarily innovative approach that also fulfills the mission of Prince Alwaleed bin Talal. So again, these are simply ideas I toss out, and I'd love to open the floor up for questions.
Thank you. I was really struck by the comment of the professor from Cambridge about convergence, and it brings me back to the 70s when there was discussion about convergence between the Soviet Union and the United States, which of course that didn't quite work the way as originally intended. But here I think there is a real substantial basis to talk about convergence. And I want to refer to the Gallup report that came out 2 years ago on a survey of values held by Muslims around the world. And I think it was especially the Middle East, but Patrick I think may remember better than me. What I found in reading that report was confirmation of what I had discovered in coming to Lebanon, which is that most Muslims have the same values as the supporters of Sarah Palin, and that especially very, very strong family values. And the supporters, the paradox, and paradox is, it's not a humorous paradox, it's really a deadly paradox, which is that American fundamentalists many of them want to destroy people who probably agree with them more than anyone else in the world. And I think that that's one of the most disturbing things about the situation, but at the same time might be a basis for dealing with the problem. So with that, I pass. Thanks.
Yes, did you want to respond, Dr. Suleiman or Dr. Leach? Or?
We have been talking for a long time, so I think let's just listen to a few questions, and we can answer very, very briefly. I would be very brief.
John Esposito, I believe right here in front of you.
Before I make my main comment, because Gallup was referred to, I think that I'm a Gallup senior scientist as well as some other things. And I think that what the data does show is the question of family values and how strong it is. Whether that's necessarily a positive or negative depends on who you're dealing with, because certainly family values when it comes to Roman Catholics, etc., it's really when you push it to the far right that it becomes, I think, the real issue. And you see that emerging also in the Gallup data when it talks about the fact that more than 50% of Americans, for example, believe that our laws should be based upon the Bible. So then you begin to see the clicking with the Muslim fundamentalist. The positive part on the value side is the sort of common concerns about issues of freedoms, civil society, etc. The comment I wanted to make, which is not a super serious one, but I just can't resist, is that the last three speakers I think dovetailed beautifully. I think that you talking about the question of the classical and modern approach when it comes to Islam, that's within, I think, a broader context of the debate within education about a more classical and a more modern approach. And that's within the broader thing, which also dovetails with what John talked about, of whether or not one talks about disciplines, one talks about regional studies, etc. I think that where the two Cambridges represent that perfectly is, on the one hand, the old Cambridge, and I may be saying out with the old and in with the new, I don't know. The old Cambridge represents one of the oldest universities in the world, one of the great universities of the world, and one of the great classical approaches to education. The question is whether or not that classical approach, which is important, my first area of studies was the classics, is not at times medieval when it comes to modern education, and when it particularly comes to modern forms of approaching and understanding cultures and civilizations. Certainly within Middle East studies, when I got into the field, it was Orientalism. And if you were going to study, it was the Journal of Oriental Studies. Well, people don't exactly beat down the doors now to run to publish there. It's not that what they do is not important, but people realize that more than language and literature for understanding cultures are social sciences, etc. If one wants to get away from the older style, where, for example, you could have one of the great scholars of Sufism, a very famous British scholar, feel that he never needed to go to the Muslim world to engage live Sufis in order to be an expert, and he was an expert on the literature of Sufis. So I think this brings out part of the dynamic that we have in terms of our educational system, but also in terms of the debate over clash. Because one of the things you notice is people who get into the clash are people who will simply quote a scripture. They will simply out of context say, well, what Islam is what the Quran says, and here's one text of the Quran. And so it really, in their mind, doesn't matter how 1.5 billion Muslims today think about that text, or even how 1.5 billion Muslims today think about the concept of jihad. It's kind of, they'll say, no, but Ibn Taymiyyah said, and then that becomes representative of the entire religion. That mentality also exists, of course, in Christian fundamentalist groups, and it exists among some Roman Catholics, for example, particularly in the higher levels of Roman Catholicism, and particularly in the very higher levels of Roman Catholicism. Thank you. I said that as a Roman Catholic.
Thank you. I was thinking that the idea of engagement may be a better word than integration. After all, both of these subjects began with something presumably simple like a religion, a nation. And I think, of course, I know American studies much better, and I can see what's happened is that we've questioned the category tremendously, and the very idea of what is a nation, how it starts, we've sort of deconstructed these narratives and these myths, and indeed the very idea that it's something geographically contained, as now it's become a very transnational study, as of course Islam should always have been as well. But the other thing that interests me about this is that in both cases, I wonder what it is intellectually that we bring to try to understand what we used to simply call a religion and a nation, because these categories are pretty malleable, and the sort of political force that can go into one sort of category of social connection, like religion or race or nation or language, seems to be changing through time and responding to all kinds of different forces. And so when we create a studies or a discipline or a subdiscipline which is based on a category, are we really limiting ourselves unless we're constantly aware of all of these other things? And then it does make you schizoid, because you realize that, oh, I'm studying America, but you can't study America by itself. You can only study it relationally. And then everything gets called into question, and it is somewhat confusing. I was thinking about a point that Dr. Mazrui brought up the other day about these terrible fights going on in Nigeria and Jos, between Muslims and Christians. Is this a theological debate? I don't know what religion actually has to do with it, except that this is the form it's being expressed in. Here in Lebanon, religion has been filled with all sorts of political power. Most of the Shia used to be communists. Now they're not anymore. They're organized around religion. politically. My own ancestors came from Ireland, and after 1,200 years of British rule, Catholicism seemed to be the most important way of resisting British rule. I mean, these things are so malleable that I wonder if what we have in common, or what we should have in common, is how to understand sort of culture and power and how these things work through time and how malleable they are, because I think that, you know, that sort of engagement would be very useful.
Thank you for the very interesting discussion. I had a question about the Harvard course. It seems intriguing and quite effective from my perspective, given that a majority of Americans who are not necessarily focused on this subject base their perceptions and opinions of Muslims on news which feeds in through the media and which is disproportionately focused on politics and especially the voices of radicals. So it makes sense for them to understand Muslims through media created by Muslims, which expresses their own identity from within, speaking of the insider-outsider perspective. My question is, could you tell us a little bit about Harvard's role in the creation of courses and innovation? Is this course something that you foresee being recreated in different ways within Harvard? Is it something that you foresee being duplicated outside of Harvard? And any other sort of points that you may like to add?
Shouldn't you identify yourself as an insider in this case? You're a double insider.
My question is also about the Harvard course and to the extent in which these courses are for the elite, like it's in Harvard and not everyone gets to go to Harvard, and Islamic studies are in AUB and not everyone in Lebanon gets to go to AUB. So what about the public that don't have access to these elite universities and elite journals and elite articles? How is the public going to be affected by these Islamic studies and how are they going to benefit from these courses? So to what extent is the effect of these courses spreading out into the region and to the community as much as it's being limited into projects, with all due respect, and I really admire your work, but I just want to know to what extent it's being spread out into the world. Thank you.
Hello, I have a few questions. The first one is, so I understand how American universities can more comprehensively teach Islamic studies through the Harvard course, but how can universities in the Islamic world comprehensively teach American studies, the Asian American experience, Latino studies, queer studies? As a fourth-generation Asian American woman living in Lebanon, I often find people remarking that, oh, so you're just from Korea, and I have to explain, no, I'm not. The second question, I understand that we're able to be critical of the religious right in the US, and it's an accepted fact, a very unfortunate one that we do have one, but it seems as though it's just too taboo to talk about their counterpart in the Middle East in this academic curriculum, that if we talked about, you know, religious fundamentalists in the Islamic world, I would just be branded as right-wing or it's just too irrelevant. So is there any sort of equity there? And then the third question, I'm very curious because we had a town hall at AUB about this. What do you all think of the boycott of Israeli academics, since we're sitting in an atmosphere of engagement and conviviality? So if you could address those three, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, would the panel like to engage with some of these comments, or are there more comments from the floor before we proceed?
I would actually quite like to make a comment, but I'd like to give you the chance to sort of remember all of the questions that have been asked and respond to them, and then if you could just sort of come back to me if there's a minute at the end.
All right,
Thank
fine,
you.
let's do that. Would you like to begin, Ali, since there were questions directly addressed?
Why don't I start out with some of the questions addressed about this Harvard course. Now, I think I want to frame this course not so much as this, the conflict between approaches, like there's the classical approach and now there's this more modern approach. I think what I'm trying to do here is, first of all, at Harvard, the study of Islam is moving outside of Middle Eastern studies. So it's no longer, the study of Islam is now moved into the study of religion. So we are studying Islam not within the boundaries of Middle Eastern studies, and we've made that move. So all the appointments that are now taking place in Islam are based in the study of religion. So when you're based in the study of religion, you're actually interacting with the field of religious studies, and which means that you're going to interact with colleagues who are teaching about other religious traditions as well. And you have to then place the study and teaching of Islam within this larger context. And you see this move even reflected in the American Academy. So for instance, the American Academy of Religion, which used to have very few panels and members who actually did, have panels on Islam. And if you were interested in Islam, you went to the MESA, the Middle Eastern Studies Con. Now, in fact, the situation's reversed, and you're finding the American Academy of Religion has become the place where people who study and talk about Islam go to, rather than Middle Eastern studies. So now when we're talking about the study of religion in a liberal arts context, what I was trying to show was that, in fact, to cultivate what I'm saying, to cultivate what I'm calling literacy about religion and culture, and this is, to think about broadly in a liberal arts education. What makes a person educated? We talk about financial literacy, we talk about mathematical literacy, we talk about scientific literacy, we talk about computer literacy. We have all kinds of literacy. How is it that we do not have, that we don't talk about that a person has to be literate about religion and culture? And this is what we are trying to introduce into the dialogue. And we introduce it into the liberal arts curriculum, that what makes a person educated. Yes, you have to take your math courses and you have to take your history and so on and so forth, but you also need to take courses on religion and culture. And to understand religion as a very complex phenomena that is in fact embedded in many different contexts, the political, economic, historical, and yes, the literary and the artistic. So if you take that as the premise, that means you can study religion. The study of religion is in fact interdisciplinary. So if you take one discipline, you have to realize that your perspective is limited by that discipline, and that you can actually then move into another discipline. Now, for example, even if you're approaching Islam through literature and the arts intersect inevitably with economics, with political ideologies, with I would also say socioeconomic social status, and so on and so forth. I mean, if you think about how people, who has access to the Quran, and so on and so forth, there are all kinds of issues that come. So even if you approach things through the arts and literature, the conversation becomes very complicated, because inevitably you are trying to foster this interdisciplinary approach where there's the politics of the art and the politics of the literature. And when a poet writes something, or Rumi, for example, writes his Masnavi, yes, he's making a literary statement, but he's also making a political statement at the same time. So we have to think about, therefore, religion in more complex ways. So in using this approach, what I am interested, what I'm thinking about is really helping students think about religion in more complex ways, and use lenses that they normally don't use to think about religion. And having them think about religion in these new ways actually breaks some of the stereotypes about religion, right? And how they think about religion. So that is really one of the purposes. And this kind of a course, for instance, this kind of a methodology, if you look at some of the religion courses that are, say, for example, being taught about Buddhism or about Hinduism in this liberal arts curriculum, they're really following the same approach. So, for example, a colleague of mine is teaching modern Buddhism in modern context, and it's a comparative study of Buddhist ideologies within China, Japan, Thailand, and Sri Lanka, right? And each trying to say, well, in fact, ideas about religion are constructed. So, and having students realize that religion and Islam doesn't say or do anything. right? As I often tell them, that nobody's met Mr. Islam who tells them that, this is what it's constructed. And all these multiple contexts play a very important role in understanding constructions of Islam. So this larger goal of Islamic studies is, in fact, to create this literacy about religion, to think about religion in complicated ways. Yes, I'm working on this in an elite university setup, but I think the impact of it, on the one hand, with just the current students that I have, is that it grows, because it's in a liberal arts curriculum. You have people all across the disciplines taking it. Hopefully they will turn out to be leaders. It'll make a difference. But another initiative that I didn't talk about, that I'm very much involved in too, is teaching this kind of a course through distance learning. So this semester I've also pioneered a course to the Division of Continuing Education, where I have 100 students all around the world who are taking not exactly this course, but another course that also talks about Islam as contextually constructed. And I have students from Dubai and Singapore and Switzerland and Australia. Everybody comes in and takes this, so there is that larger outfit. And a third aspect of this is I'm working very closely with a program in religion and secondary education at Harvard, which reaches out to teachers in high schools and helps them think about religion in more complex ways. And it's teachers who are really in social studies, in English literature, in history. So it's trying to, again, emphasize the interdisciplinarity of the study of religion. I want to make just one more comment in regard to these conflicts that we see, for example, the conflict in Nigeria. And I think it's a very interesting question that, yes, overtly this is seen as a conflict between Muslims and Christians. They're using religious language and religious symbols. But if you use the contextual or the cultural studies approach, you think about, well, what has constructed this religious viewpoint? And it's inevitably tied to economics, it's tied to politics, and you realize that while the overt expressions are religious, the underlying motivations are really not religious, right? And this is the advantage of this contextual approach, that once students realize that if people start using religious language, it's really not about religion. They need to deconstruct it and figure out what is it really about, right? So with that.
Thank you, John. You had a comment, and then Yasser.
I have two very different comments. One that I hope is quick because it's a huge comment. It's a huge subject, but I think that Ali and Yasser have given us a remarkable demonstration of the two grandly different fields of battle in Islamic studies. Yasser said, well, it's not just a matter of can the outsider non-Muslim say anything good about Islam, but he said, can Muslims really present an objective view of Islam? Embedded in that is the idea that anybody can say anything objective about Islam. And it is, as John was saying, we have a long, grand tradition of social science analysis that somehow says that there is, which is now sort of the new or the old-fashioned secular fundamentalism, that you can find the truth if you use objective social science. That's an old standard. The question is, does it apply to what we're dealing with, especially if we've got Dean Patrick's fluid categories all the time? If religion is a fluid category, how can it mean the same thing to Max Weber 100 years ago as it means to an analyst now? And then, of course, Ali put the frosting on the cake by saying, well, of course, Islam, even the believers, it's a construction. and the constructionist approach and the objectivist approach are the battle lines. Now, of course, the problem, I was all set to really do my little khutbah for Ali's constructionism until he finished it off with an objectivist thing, which was the conflicts in Nigeria. Well, they use religious labels, but what we really have to do is search for what are the real motivations, which shows us again the fluid category of religion, which starts again with some kind of an assumption that people really believe more in their economic interests than they believe in their faith interests. And I'm not sure that that's where we are at this point. But the bottom line, rather, is a totally different thing from the question of the young lady who had to leave. But that is this question of what's the public benefit for all these projects? Because quite frankly, my understanding of why we've all gotten our funding is that the Prince believes that there is a public benefit for all of this. And I think that the public benefit for these projects is where it's part of the thing that Ali was beginning with, and that we're all dealing with at this present time, and that is that how we talk about the issues that are really powerfully meaningful to humanity at the beginning of the 21st century, how we talk about it, what words we use, how we analyze it, becomes crucial. And this is why it becomes important to have centers for Islamic studies and Center for American Studies and Center for Muslim-Christian Relations. And part of the contribution that we make is that we help people who influence the way the public thinks. We help people to develop vocabularies that make it possible to talk about things in 21st century terms. I know that I have a number of my own students who have sort of gone out, and they may have gone to an elite university, but now they're in sort of the Midwest, and they send me their op-ed pieces for the local newspapers. And sometimes it makes me a little bit nervous because I hear the courses that we've had in the Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding certificate for undergraduates. I hear our rhetoric of goodwill, because that is what we're, I think, about. I hear our rhetoric of goodwill shaping the idea that people who believe in religion are human, and people who believe in religion that maybe that's important to them. And I think the worst, best example that I have is one of our certificate people from a number of years ago. When he came to our courses, was off-the-wall right-wing conservative. And now he is a commentator on terrorism who frequently appears on Fox. And probably only I know what impact we had, because to the normal person, he sounds like a really right-wing person. But my God, we moved him 20 miles to the left. And I know that because I've talked to him about, and I can hear echoes of some of my own sermons even in Fox News. But
yes, sir.
I'm sorry, I want to reconstruct myself, and because I'm not accepting John Wall's reconstruction of me. So let me reconstruct myself, and again, sort of get away from this clash which John Esposito introduced. It's almost like a heresy that he's nurtured now. So I would like also to deal with that heresy. The mother and the daughter, the two Cambridges, are not actually separated from each other. What I wanted, we're not talking about what we do in terms of public outreach and in terms of influencing. What I was taught, it is about Islamic studies and American studies. It's not a question of anything else. Now, when I say, when I said that I wouldn't be able to do what Ali, and I admire what he's doing in Harvard, I wouldn't be able to do that in Cambridge. I think I wouldn't be able to do it because I wanted to introduce the complexity of the institutional setting for defining a discipline. That's my point. It's not about, it's not an issue of principle, it's not an issue of what is Islamic studies. You need to take the institutional setting into account in the way that you actually promote your subject, or you deliver your subject, or you deal with your subject. We are not, for example, in the UK, at least in Cambridge, we are not a liberal arts kind of program. Islamic studies, or teach Islamic studies in the way that you have done. Secondly, when I talked about objective, I wasn't actually saying that there's something objective about an objective fact that can, in a kind of logical, positivist way, be measured and weighed, tested, smelt, and I didn't mean that at all. What I meant is this, is that I was at interviews for chairs. I was interviewing for a chair, and the Vice Chancellor asked me, and he said, can a Muslim present Islam in an objective way, right? Because Hugh was talking about, Muslims might ask the question, can an outsider talk about Islam in a way that Muslims would recognize it, okay? So I said there's a flip side to this. That's my point. So even in my lifetime, within the space of 15 minutes, I have been reconstructed and deconstructed. So let me go back and say, I think what we talked about in terms of integrating Islamic studies with American studies, without really going about this in a way that is going to be accepted to the academy, is frankly waffle. And I'm going to be provocative, waffle. Just absolute, total waffle. I want to know what is Islamic studies, what is American studies, what do they consist of, what methodologies do they use, what approaches do they use, where are the contact points, where are the convergences, where are the divergences. When you have done that, and then you come to me and I say to you, yes, I'm going to buy this of you. But before that, statements of goodwill in the academy are not going to get you that far. They might get you that far in the public arena. And I'm 100% with you. Of course, I want to present a positive, not a positive actually, a nuanced picture of Islam, not necessarily in a way that promotes it in a apologetic kind of way. And I'm just getting to the point that the lady there asked. I actually do believe that if you're talking about Islamic studies, you need to talk about so-called radical fundamentalist sort of perceptions of it. You can't get away from it. That is a dishonest way of dealing with the subject. And I think most subjects will deal with it. But they will not deal with it in a stereotypical kind of way. They'll deal with it in a way that deconstructs it and shows it to be a construction, and show it to be also perhaps a projection of our anxieties, our fears onto something else, in order to give us a sense of wholeness and coherence as people with identities that can function in a way that simplifies the world, because stereotypes have the function of making the world look simple and easy to deal with. There are those who are with us, those who are against us, those who we love, we hate. The world becomes a very simple world. I think our duty as academics is to make it messy. And what I was trying to do is to make all the questions that we have talked about really messy, and then try out of that mess to come up with something that we can sell to very skeptical, as I said, the most skeptical of skeptics, academics in our universities.
Yes, I know that Jerry wants to say something. I assume Hugh does also.
All right. I'd like to address that question also raised by the lady on the right, the question of the boycott of Israeli academics. I don't know your circumstances here in Lebanon or at AUB. I understand the topic is controversial, but I'd love to hear from you out there about what the stance of the university is and what the practices actually are. I can, however, give you a case study, and a very relevant one, and also give you my personal opinion at the end. Essentially, AUC in Cairo has what I would call the typical American university policy, that the university is open to all points of view and ready to engage with people from anywhere in the world and anywhere on the political continuum, et cetera. And that would seem on the face of it to imply that Israeli academics could come speak, or that Israeli students were legitimate students to be admitted given their qualifications and the like. Now, this is the official policy. This is what you'll hear when you hear from the administration of AUC. This is, I guess, what's on our website, et cetera. However, there's an unofficial policy, and the unofficial policy is actually much stronger and the unofficial policy is effectively the reverse of the official policy. And the unofficial policy, again, is far stronger and actually enforced largely by the student body and secondarily by the faculty rather than the administration itself. So what's the unofficial policy? The unofficial policy is very straightforward. We will have nothing to do with Israelis under any circumstances. So any invitation to an Israeli academic, or indeed for that matter an Israeli businessman or member of the Israeli government or whatever, would be automatically shouted down and automatically get the individual who was responsible for the idea or the proposal, et cetera, get them into very hot water and make life very unpleasant for them. Now, the unofficial policy is in fact the actual practice of the university. There are no Israeli students, sadly. The actual practice is also that there are no invitations to Israelis to participate in anything that the university does. And of course, you can very well imagine, as I'm sure happens here, there are a number of symposia, discussions, conferences on the Arab-Israeli conflict, et cetera, but they will never have an Israeli as a part of them, et cetera. Now, just a case study which I think shows the depth of this policy and also its counterproductiveness. When I arrived at the university, in my entering class of faculty members was somebody from Stanford who was an expert in Middle Eastern studies. He was, in fact, a Jewish American. He was the only Jewish American on the faculty at that point in time. But very, very interestingly, he was a Jewish American who was very, very strongly anti-Israeli and very strongly pro-Palestinian. In other words, a category of individual that the members of the faculty, and particularly of the students, did not actually recognize. They didn't actually know that there could be somebody who was a Jewish American who was anti-Israeli. So I thought, well, having him there at AUC with this point of view would open a door for further understanding of the nature of the American Jewish community and the spread of opinion in it, and it would perhaps be, it would basically maybe lead to a softening of the situation, or in a minimum, better understanding, et cetera. Well, in his second year, this individual, who again, mid-career Stanford faculty member, all the right tickets, former president of the Middle East Studies Association, et cetera, he had an American Jewish student in Middle Eastern Studies. Middle Eastern Studies, by the way, at AUC is mostly foreigners, not Arabs, not individuals. It's mostly people coming in from the outside world. So it's largely a program for foreigners, not by design, but by the way it works out. He had an American Jewish student, and the Jewish student held views that were quite different from the Egyptian students on the campus. The Jewish student wanted to write a paper in defense of something that Israel had done. I never got the detail at that point in time. And given the normal practices of academic freedom, et cetera, the professor said, fine, you go ahead and write it. You know, we're open to all points of view. And it got out. It got out beyond the Middle East Studies program. And basically, he was hammered, and his life was made virtually unbearable. And he was, I would say, effectively driven out, because at the end of that academic year, he went back to the U.S. and probably won't reappear, or at least embittered by his circumstances. So that's the policy, official, unofficial. The practice is very one-sided, you know, no Israelis under any circumstances whatsoever, et cetera. To me, it's exactly what the, you know, basically trying to bridge the chasm is all about. So I don't support the unofficial policy. I support the official policy. The official policy is only weakly supported by the administration, and I can understand why, because if you get identified as a pro-Israeli institution in Egypt, you're probably on your way out of Egypt. You're certainly going to be on shaky grounds when you go to deal with the government, et cetera. So I understand why the AUC administration is weak in the knees when it comes time to defend this policy, and it is weak in the knees, but I'm really sorry that that is in fact the case, and I would hope that somewhere out there in the future we can do better than we're doing now.
Hugh, please.
Thanks very much, and I'm not going to be able to comment on all the questions, obviously, but I'll try and comment on one or two. Just coming back to definition again, American studies and Islamic studies are, of course, shorthand terms, and you don't have to think about them for very long before you discover that they are contested and they deal with very complex realities. But so is history, so is politics. It's a shorthand term. It starts the discussion, but the discussion, of course, needs to be continued. And with respect to either American studies or Islamic studies, as soon as you begin that discussion, you very quickly realize that Americans don't always agree with each other any more than Muslims always agree with each other. So there is a spectrum of thought which is there within both traditions. And just a little comment on Professor Esposito's comment about scriptures, for example. Even in scriptures, there are, of course, slightly different messages, slightly contested concepts, not least about religious diversity. So the Quran says slightly different things about other religions, depending which surah you're looking at. And again, therefore, even in that area, there is perhaps a debate which can be had. Just finally, on the boycott question, from the perspective of the UK, for example, there are, of course, very distinguished Israeli academics in British universities. And just to mention one, Professor of International Relations in the University of Oxford, Professor Avi Schleim, is well known as a very critical voice on many Israeli policies. He had an interesting article in The Guardian, a left-wing, serious newspaper, just literally about 2 weeks ago, in which he described the possibility of peace talks about territory between Arabs and Israelis in the following rather interesting analogy. He said, it is like two people sitting down to discuss sharing a pizza, while one of them is eating it. Now, that's an interesting analogy, and of course it's far more powerful coming from him than it is from an outsider. So that may be one factor in certain contexts, at least.
I know Ali has a comment he'd like to make. I'd like to answer your question about race and how this has been one of the central subjects, I think, of American studies as it was developed by Patrick McGreevy and a number of the scholars that we have had, including the present Said Chair, Noel Ignatieff, just gave a course on race. I'm teaching Intro to American Studies, and overwhelmingly it is the voices which had heretofore been excluded from official histories to sort of rejoin, Hugh's critique of what Yasser said about a discipline, because a discipline has been in existence for, 200 years or 300 years or 500 years or whatever. If we have the tools to critique it, it's very interesting that these disciplines, because they're somewhat new and they're very willing to engage in criticism, are themselves more vulnerable. Whereas if you ask historians, well, what about Hayden White? And many of them will go, oh, well, Hayden White is an apostate. He's not, he's out of the fold. And yet much of the most interesting work in all disciplines are done by rebels, people who are outside them. I think that one of the great revelations to me, for example, was to start the Intro to American Studies course this year talking about the question of race and how easy it is to displace onto the United States. And then when you talk about the ethnic background of the people who inhabit this country, what their citizenship rights are, what what would happen, for example, if their mother is a Lebanese citizen and their father is a Norwegian, and they grew up here as opposed to someone who grew up in Vancouver and the father is Lebanese and the mother is a Canadian. The offspring would be Lebanese in Vancouver and not here, or of Sri Lankan domestics, for example. Immediately, that discussion became a very heated discussion. I know that Professor Harb, who's sitting right beside you and is also one of the members of our executive committee and has been closely involved too, that these questions you simply can't, I think, have any kind of useful, adequate, interesting discourse about the United States without race, as Toni Morrison and many others have said, front and center. It's the 800-pound gorilla in the room. It's always there, even when it's not being talked about. And the interesting question I have is this: the ease with which many of my students displace it onto somewhere else. And this also is how we end up dealing with Europe in the equation. Inevitably, can you become a German if you're a second, third generation guest worker from Turkey and you've been living in Berlin and your grandfather, are you German? Of course you're not. You cannot become a German. If you're a Danish, whatever, these are the sorts of questions I think that disciplines like American studies, comparative literature, Islamic studies ask, because they have this comparative approach necessarily. Frequently, we don't have all the tools we need. In other words, I don't have all the languages I need. I don't have all of the background and everything I need to do it. And therefore, I feel somewhat insecure in the face of the kind of very legitimate critique of Yassir. I think anyone should feel a little insecure. I don't know everything I need to know to engage in this conversation, but I can frame it in a way that I think's effective, and I think that's the way that American Studies here is very intentionally involved, and I think that's a decision that Patrick made himself and through the faculty that was hired. We had one scholar from Germany, we had a number from different locations, and this has been a front and center question. I don't think you can talk about the U.S. without talking about ethnicity. Ali, maybe you had a comment, and then I think maybe we should see if there's one more comment and we should go. It's about 4:30, isn't it?
The lady with red hair down
So,
there.
All right, yes, you have a question, and we'll let you have the last word. Or
So-
Ali wants to say something? Sure.
So I think this issue about disciplines, for me, listening to all of this, I've been thinking about, well, where do I put this in terms of disciplines? For me, the interesting questions are not about discipline. I think the questions that are that become crucial for somebody who's teaching about Islam in a liberal arts context, and even I think even among scholars or among students who are studying Islam, specialists in Islam, is the crucial question today is, what does it mean to be Muslim today in this context? Because primarily, we are trying to create an understanding in the public of what it means to be Muslim today, and there are many different constructions, many different responses to this. And part of what my course tries to do is to say, well, through the arts and literature, you inevitably get into diversity. And you have very different answers to this. And so to expose students to the broad spectrum that really, look, there are many different answers to this, and Muslims are going to construct their answers, and they're based on their context. And this becomes the key question, and where I see it intersecting with American studies is really the question that's confronting American studies today, from what I see, is what does it mean to be American? And how definitions of what is meant to be American have shifted over time, and how people are responding to this. And in their response, we get really a broad spectrum of views in the American context, and it's reflected certainly politically, but socially, but I think also in literature and so on. So these are sort of these questions that are these parallel questions. What does it mean to be Muslim? What does it mean to be American? In terms of the, what I said about the Nigerian context, I think maybe I misspoke or didn't frame things correctly. It's not that religion is not important, but there's a certain construction of religion that has occurred because it is being interpreted within a certain context. Right. And what is that context? Right? So it's not to say this has nothing to do with religion. Absolutely it has to do with religion. But it is a particular construction of religion based on a particular context. Because not all Muslims think like the Muslims who are in this confrontation, because their ways of interpreting Islam are different. So that's really what I meant. So I think this idea of trying to move away from essentializing or redefining Islam, that's the point that I was trying to make.
Maybe we could close with two comments from this very patient young woman here, and then Dr. Mazrui also wanted to make a comment. Is it on, Maria? Yeah.
So in that case, as someone that's really personally, engaged in this as well, I listened with great interest and with great enthusiasm to everything you had to say, really enjoyed the comments, and, sort of nice balloon gets built up as the panel goes along, and as so often happens, we get to the end and somebody comes in with a pin. So I liked your challenge to the discipline and to why to link them and how to link them. I think it's first very important to point out that, the idea of studies to me indicates interdisciplinarity. So when we're talking about methodologies, what would indicate and link American and Islamic studies is clearly interdisciplinarity, that we can work between methodologies and employ different techniques. But I wanted to sort of point out to you all of the different themes and how nicely they went together, because I think that popularly, or in the past at least, American studies and Islamic studies had opposite tendencies. So, for example, Orientalism was based in studies of Islamic literature and arts primarily, whereas the study of the industrialized world has been primarily based in social sciences. So we have arts literature versus social sciences. Then you move on to the American world being almost exclusively studied from an insider perspective at first, and that it's actually been universalized to a point whereas when we're talking about Western studies, we're talking about universal studies, international relations, political science, these are all disciplines in the West. And meanwhile, when it comes to Orientalism, again, clearly that was defined by an outsider's perspective on the Islamic world, so insider versus outsider, another theme you talked about. Then contemporary versus classical. We tend to focus on the present and the future in the American context, emphasizing dynamism and progress, whereas the study of Islam has often been presented as static, monolithic, timeless, etc. Finally, fundamentalisms. At the moment, we're obsessed with religious fundamentalisms and Islamic fundamentalisms particularly, whereas in the past, and I would say up until the present, we have to a certain extent ignored or toned down discussion of secular fundamentalisms and how fundamentalism in the West, etc., is also a serious problem and a serious danger. So to me, that kind of actually points out a couple of different ways that one discipline or one study can learn from the other by taking the habits or the tendencies of the other and trying to adapt them to study both. Finally, in the question of why bother linking them, what is to be gained from the exercise of Islamic and American studies, I think that you have to focus on the insider versus outsider's perspective. And, Said always cautioned about the danger of reverse Orientalism. So I think that in this point, Professor Goddard's point about working together is the key, that what we're trying to do is establish something where insider and outsider perspectives can work together to, in some ways, correct the tendencies that I pointed out. So there's my response, and I hope that, it's helpful in some way.
We're going to give the last word here to Dr. Mazrui here in the front. But the conversation will continue this evening down where at Issam Ferris. Is that where we are this afternoon?
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. And it's been a very profitable evening, and we've learned a lot about shared interests and expanded our horizons. I just want to put on the table one method of starting to combine American studies with Islamic studies. Remember, Alexander Pope had this line, the proper study of mankind is man. So if I revised it as the proper study of American and Muslims is the study of American Muslims. I myself teach a course of a section of those Muslims. I've taught a course at Columbia University on African American experience with Islam. And there's lots of room for comparisons on issues that are of immediate interest to African Americans, about the history of race in Islam as against in the West, about the history of slavery in Islam as against in the West, and about the nature of treatment of women in Western world as against what is happening. So you go comparative, looking at Muslims who are Americans or Westerners, and then you attempt to have conclusions from them. The most difficult one I had was when a black man came to say, I have to go to Iraq, I'm a Muslim, I want to do my paper on the dilemmas of a Muslim in fighting American wars. So I said, well, you are the right person to do it. So handle that. And he did that. I'm not sure he resolved the major dilemmas. But what I'm saying is you can tackle issues of American studies and Muslim studies by studying Muslims in the American context, at least as a beginning.
It's a wonderful note to close on. The conversation will continue. At ISM Ferris, we'll have our second panel, which is this evening at 6, Building Bridges for Better Understanding Between the Arab Muslim Worlds and the West. And I think, there we may have more of a public policy or taking the pulse at the moment from different locations, but we can certainly rejoin some of these questions. I'm sure there'll be overlap, and we're enormously grateful for all of you for your patience and participation. We look forward to seeing you this evening.